Hello, I'm Joanne May, and I'm happy you've joined me for this tutorial on painting a winter scene Christmas card. The first brush I'm using is a very lovely soft mop brush. It's a silver black velvet, small, but it's also called jumbo round. It holds a lot of water, and as you see, I have my paper taped down. I've already folded the card underneath the tape, and I'm not using any sketching, just a line of the landscape scene, which will be a hill. The sky will be the first part that I do, so I'm wetting the whole sky area. And this area here is going to be painted with two colors mixed together. First, it's Ultramarine Blue, which you see me taking out of my palette now. It's a beautiful pigment, and I always love it when I'm doing skies, particularly night skies, when it's mixed with burnt sienna, because the reddish brown mixed with the deep blue gives a grayish tint to this blue color and makes it look darker, more like a night sky. So that is the mixture that I'm using, and in a minute you will also see me pick up some dioxazine purple to add some color variation in the sky. It's all very wet still, but I wanted to brush across the paper several times with a wet paintbrush before adding the color to be sure that the water is soaked all the way through the paper, because that will keep it wet for a bit of time while I work the colors into it. I'm outlining a little bit there for the hill shape, but any shape will do, even a straight line across, as long as it's not dividing the paper in half, can work beautifully. The halfway point is just a little bit less beautiful to look at. 2/3 and 1/3 of sky landscape or landscape sky works very nicely, and that's approximately what I was trying to achieve here. So I have mostly sky and a little bit of land underneath, which will be snow. And so this is a nighttime scene. I am finding that the water in the paper has diluted the depth of color, so I keep adding more to the color. And you see there's nothing magical about the brush strokes. It's just slap it on in any old way, but the water really just takes that pigment and blends it so beautifully. You'll see in the final painting after it dries just how nice the sky looks. Right now it looks like a mess to me as I'm looking at it, but the end result, I'm confident even at this point in my painting that the water will take care of my lack of careful brushing. So there you have now a new brush. I'm using a smaller brush to add the most magical thing that I have ever done, I think, with watercolor. There's so many techniques, but this one is just magical. That's all I can say. What I have done is I've gotten a lot of water on this very small brush. It's a Grumbacher number 4 round, and you can't see anything happening probably at this stage, because in some parts of the wash that I put on with the blue and the purple, it's starting to dry. In other parts it's still really wet, so it's a variable wetness and dryness process. So you just take this wet smaller brush and just dab a little bit into the wet, turning damp, turning dry around the edges paint that you just put on, and look now what's happening. Suddenly the water, the clear water on the brush, pushes the pigment away and creates the most gorgeous night stars that light up the sky. One thing you may notice is that there's a very big blob of water on the left side in that purple area, and it looks like a mess. All the other stars look so beautiful, and that one had, I must have had a lot more water on the brush when I dropped that water onto the purple, but it's not a mistake really, it's just a happy accident, and you'll see how I deal with that. I don't see that as a star that's like all of the other stars, larger or smaller, but this one's just a huge blob, so I have a plan for how I can make that look like it is incorporated into the painting. I'm just adding some shapes to the snow hill area, and now I'm taking a little bit larger damp brush and smoothing out the edges of those lines that I put in, so that there's some that are harder lines and some a little softer. Adding just a few grasses that are peeking through, and I'm never very concerned about making a painting like this look realistic, in the sense that the grasses are probably sort of brownish, maybe blonde color, bleached out, but I'm just using gray with some blue and whatever is the palette dirt. You see my palette, I almost never clean it off because I can always use something that is on there for little grassy things like this. And you'll see that I'm just touching in, not sure how much of that I want to have peeking through the snow, and a little later you'll see that I'll add to what I started with here. So now I'm ready to begin thinking about what I'm going to do along the horizon line of where the sky meets the snow. And I need, before I can add paint to that area, I need to dry the sky so that what I put onto the horizon won't bleed anymore into that sky. I have the sky the way I want it. It's now flattened back down because it did buckle up a little bit with all the water, and it's working now nicely to be fully dried before I start adding in shadows of trees all along that horizon line. So at first I was going in with a very thick combination of ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I decided I wanted some background trees first, so I added quite a bit of water into that very dark pigment. It's even more intense than what I put in the sky initially. And you see the first place I'm going is right over that star that was too big. So you'll see the light shining through from behind that shadowy tree, and that worked well to make it balance out with the other stars. So I'm just adding little bits here of the pigment, just dot, dot, dot. I'm doing it in a tree shape, pine tree shape. It's gray blue pigment, and after this layer of the shadowed trees, or the background trees, if you will, then I will add layers of more foreground trees with a much darker value of this ultramarine and burnt sienna combination. I don't really plan where I'm placing the trees, but I try very hard not to place them evenly spaced out, because that's just not the way nature is. It's much better to put them in random places, very close together, and maybe one individual tree farther away. Or if you have a whole forest, you might do several layers of these lighter shades of the black, sort of grayish. The lighter they are, the farther away they are, the darker, the closer they look. So that gives your painting depth. I only did 2 layers in this one, since it's a card that I'll be sending to someone. But if I'm doing a painting that I might want to frame, I'll probably do 3-4 different layers of the trees in a forest type of a setting like this. I think it's always nice to go off the edge of the painting with a partial view of a tree, because that also makes it look more realistic, I think, especially if you're taking a photograph of something with trees in it. You're never going to be able to eliminate a whole tree and find a clear-cut spot unless the trees are really far apart. But in a forest type setting like this, they're always so close together that it's nice to look like it's coming in from the side. Now I'm using a Chinese calligraphy brush. This is the smallest one. I do a lot of Chinese brush painting, and I do calligraphy. So these brushes I've used so much, and they're so hardy, so sturdy. This is the tiniest one, but as you see up close how fine those hairs are at the point, which makes it much nicer for the very tops of the trees to get some beautiful, very tiny marks that look like pine leaves at the top of the tree. As you move down, I lay the brush more down onto the paper so that more coverage will happen. You see that if you just use the tip of the brush for the closer trees with a thicker pigment, it will take forever. So I started with the tip for the top of the tree, and then I gradually laid more and more of the body of the bristles down to the paper. So the paper is completely dry. The first layer of the shadowed trees is dry, and now you see me working it a little bit to get a lot more pigment and thicker, more moisture actually at first. It's thicker, but it has to move. I didn't have nearly enough water in that little puddle because it had dried over the few minutes that I had been doing the background trees. But now you can kind of see how this one tree I'm working is creating a nice shadow effect of the first tree that's just behind it. It's really not behind it when we're working in 2 dimensions, but it gives that illusion. And this one over here needed to be darker too, so that there is more of a contrast between what's behind and what's forward. More pigment needed still. Some artists in watercolor like to mix up their combinations of colors ahead of time. I almost never do that because I want to be able to adjust as I go. For example, this tree that I'm doing right now, I added more blue into the mix. So I think that creates more interest in the painting, even something as simple as doing a card like this. So I recommend that these mixtures be various. There's in some of the trees a little more brownish red, in some of the trees a little bit more blue, and in the end maybe you can see those differences. I think there's a pretty obvious difference right now with the dark tree to the far left and the dark one that's more in the center. There's just a slightly different shade and a slightly different value, a little bit deeper value in that center one. So it looks as if I'm painting every single little pine needle, but it really only took me about 20 minutes or so to finish this whole painting. So with the right tools, this brush is what's helping me get that look as if I'm painting lots of tiny little detail, and really what I'm just doing is varying whether I'm using the tip or the side of the brush, and just dabbing in the basic shape of the tree. here's another interesting thing that I didn't decide to do until this moment, which was I had that background tree all the way going off the edge of the paper, and I decided I wanted a foreground tree to do the same thing but not cover it all the way up. So now you see that contrast between what's behind and what's in front even more realistically because of the contrast. One's lighter, one's darker, and you can really see that more once the dark goes in. So I think the next step is that I want to add some water to this horizon line, and the water is going to help the tree color bleed a little bit more into the snow. It's not really what you would see in nature, but the effect from a distance looks as if the tree color is on the top of the snow because of maybe there's a bright moon behind that's creating some shadows that would go out into the snow. And even when there's not a lot of light in a bright moon, just the light from the stars can create that shadowy look right at the horizon line. So that's what I'm doing. It's a little tricky because if you do this while the paint that's already laid down has dried, or after it has dried, you can get some bleed backs of water pushing the paint upward into the trees instead of coming down toward the bottom or downward. And so I took my paper towel there and just dabbed out a little bit of the water after I had the effect that I wanted. It's not much, but it really does make this look more beautiful and more artistic, I think. I had a hard line right there, so I just touched it up with a very tiny bristle damp brush, and now I'm bringing some of that color more down into the top of the snow. Then I got going on putting more shadows across, because it does happen. It again, as I said, depending on how bright the sky is, even in the depths of nighttime. And I started putting all of these shadows across, and then I didn't like it so much, so I took some of them back out and left others in, and in the end I think it was a good balance. If you do put in shadows for a nighttime, make sure, or for any time, make sure you know where your light source is. See, there's where I put in a lot of shadow, and then I dabbed it right out because I thought it was just too much. My light source is coming from the upper right to the lower left. Decided I wanted a little more strength on these grasses, but here's where I did put in more shadows. Because the grasses are closer to the foreground, you can see more detail, and you'll see that I added shadows to go toward the left, same direction I was putting the shadows of the trees, and I did it on each of these little tufts of grass. For more dimension, I think it just adds, again, a little bit more realism to the scene. One thing about watercolor is that it's pretty easy, unless you have a really heavy staining color, to lift out. I was doing that just a bit at the purple line. If you have a harsh line, you can take your brush if it's damp and soften some of those edges, or even just take a damp paper towel wrapped around your finger and just wipe those away gently. I would never go too heavy-handed on that kind of a strategy, but it does help things to be softer for a design like this, where everything is at a distance except for the foreground grasses, and everything should have a softness about it. So I decided I wanted more reflection of the sky lights, the stars in the sky, shining off of the trees. So this is Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. It can be used as ink, it can be used as paint. It's very opaque, so even the slightest touch will give really good coverage. And so you have to be careful not to use too much of it. You see how tiny the little brushes are that I'm using, the bristles on this brush to touch this white into the tree. Not meant to be snow laying on the tree, so I didn't do it over the whole tree. I just did it on the right hand side where the light sources are coming from. I'm assuming there's a moon somewhere up there on the upper right hand side. So I'm just touching it in, and at first that white on the first tree that I did is really too bright, so you'll see me go back over it with, once I get the dabs onto several of the trees, the white is starting to fade off of the brush, and then I'll come back to that tree again and soften it just a little bit more. So again, you see I haven't added any more white to the brush, and there's still plenty on there, even just with the slightest touch into this beautiful white ink. I love it, using it for this type of application. And now you can really see the difference between the foreground trees and the background trees. I didn't add any white reflection on the background trees. I'm trying to blend the tree branches at the lower edge of the tree into the snow a little bit there by adding more white right at the edge. Sometimes if I have too much white, I just dab it off with a damp brush. It comes off very easily. In this case, I didn't like the shape of the top of that tree, so just added 2 dots. Made all the difference to me. And now I think we're just about ready to sign and take the tape off, which is always a magical moment. I love taping the edges of my watercolors because when you take the tape off, it kind of looks a mess right there when the paint is, you see it slopped over the tape, and then the tape comes off. There's this beautiful white border all the way around the painting. And just FYI, I taped this to a clipboard, just an old clipboard that I had. I don't use very often, and it was a perfect size. This is a 5x7 piece of paper, actually 7 by 10 folded in half. So there it is. Here's the close-up, and you see how nice that sky looks. I'm always surprised. Even after I dry it, it's not quite the same as seeing it like this. So thanks so much for watching.